Thanks. Now, it's now the 26th of February 2025, and I reckon at about 2 or 3 estimates hearings ago, when I was asking you about the government's plan to regulate crypto, I think I said at the time that I had no confidence that the government would ever deliver a bill on crypto. This is despite the Treasurer promising to do so after the FTX collapsed. Now we're at the back end of this parliament, about to have an election. That was a good prediction. You've got to be right sometimes. Even a broken clock is right occasionally. But my point is, and my question is, what on earth has happened here? The Treasurer of the country has promised that the Labor Party would regulate crypto to protect consumers, to give industry confidence, and you've had 3 years and nothing's happened. What on earth has happened?
Brenton Philp, Deputy Secretary for the Markets Group. So there is work that is ongoing in this space.
We know that, but what's happened?
Well, I'll ask Mr Kelly to take us through the detail of the work.
I just want to know what went wrong. Did it get lost in Jonesy's office? Did the dog eat the bill? What happened?
Well, I don't think we're saying anything's gone wrong, Senator, but if Mr Kelly can take us through what we're up to, that'd be...
Sure. Why don't you run me through it?
Thank you.
Mr James, so James Kelly, First Assistant Secretary, Digital Competition and Payments Division. So, Senator, I mean, where we're at is kind of in some ways the same answer as last time, which is
huge progress.
We're progressing the drafting of an exposure draft of the bill to give effect to the government's planned reforms.
The draft is done. The draft was done a long time ago, wasn't it?
The draft bill.
No,
we are in the process of drafting process. Yes.
You haven't given a draft to the office?
No, Senator.
Okay. So you're telling me it's taken 3 years to draft a crypto bill?
I'm not saying that, Senator. So it's taken 3 years to go from various consultation processes and then kind of working up the instructions for OPC and then beginning to engage with OPC. Now, there are other priorities for government that affected
other priorities.
How early we've got to
Thank you for being honest.
The OPC drafter, but we're working on it now.
Thank you for your honesty, because clearly it's been deprioritised, hasn't it?
I don't think that's a fair analysis. I think the analysis is it's been a very busy legislative agenda area in that portfolio, working through a whole range of areas, including scams and all the rest of it. I mean, it's a huge amount of ledge that comes through the Senate in this portfolio. And there's been a lot of consultation done on this, on crypto, including with the industry and taking all of the feedback that's necessary.
So the Treasurer, Chalmers, said that the government would legislate a bill in this term. Is that a promise you still sticking to?
Look, I haven't been advised otherwise.
Okay, so when will you pass the bill? Haven't got many weeks of Parliament left.
No, indeed. Well, the Senate, sometimes when it wants to get on with things, can deal with things pretty quickly.
You haven't even introduced a bill yet.
Well, and as we've said, we're working on it.
I mean, all I'd say is, these are deeply unserious answers to what is a very serious question that a lot of Australians would be expecting you to be able to keep to your word, that you said that you would protect consumers but also incentivise investment in Australia through digital assets. And we're now at the end of this term. I'm sure the Minister is sincere in maintaining the government's commitment, but we all know that there's no way that a bill will pass in this term. And so I guess I'm wondering what could be done to avoid this situation in future? How could the Treasury work with the Treasury Minister to ensure that your work isn't lost? Because I know that there are a lot of good people in Treasury who've worked very hard on this and they'd be very disappointed at the outcome. So how can this be avoided in future?
Sorry, you go.
Yeah. So, Senator, we do work closely with our Treasury ministers. Matters like this do progress. A lot of that work is done behind closed doors as drafting is made available. As the Minister mentioned, it is prioritised as part of the legislative drafting resources available to us and to the ministers to ensure that the the important things go forward that are of importance to the government of the day. So in that context, we do work closely and we ensure that these things are progressing. It's not to say that this hasn't gone forward or hasn't been progressed. There is work being done. It's just that there isn't a draft legislation put forward.
So when did you seek legislative drafting status for this bill?
So, Senator, it has been in the kind of the legislative priorities process that Treasury's run. This has been kind of pretty. It's been on the list of things that are higher up the list rather than lower down. There's just been other matters.
Does it have T status?
Sorry.
Does it have T status?
T status.
Yeah.
I think we'd have to check. That's probably dealt with.
Let's take a notice, and then it, we're getting into kind of question. Like we are getting into the issues of when the election is held, future sittings of Parliament, and in some ways I don't think there's any status attached to bills of spree, for example.
Okay, so in the absence of any legislation passing Parliament, the corporate regulator, which I think fancies itself as sort of a mini kind of Parliament, is now doing its best sort of deep state work by issuing various quasi regulatory guidance.
Who are you referring to here?
The deep state, known as the big deep state, is very significant, as you know, in its breadth and depth.
I'm asking specifically who you are referring to here.
Your good friends at ASIC.
Right. So
they've now issued a piece of paper in the absence of.
I'm not sure that's an appropriate characterisation of ASIC.
Well, I'm not seeking to offend you, Minister.
At all. Well, I just feel the need to defend the corporate regulator from your derisory comments.
It's been one of your great themes of this Parliament.
What?
Defending the excellent work of ASIC.
Well, I'm proud to stand next to important public institutions, safeguard the public interest.
That's very laudable.
While others seek to tear them down.
Well, the job here is to expose wrongdoing and to identify where there could be improvements. And the point is, and the question is, what is now the result in the market's mind, do you think, of the Parliament failing to legislate anything at all in this Parliament, this term of Parliament, and instead the corporate regulator issuing a piece of paper saying what they think about crypto regulation with an info sheet? What do you think that...
Senator, as we discussed at the last estimates hearing, the government's reforms are targeted at those kind of digital assets that don't fall within the existing regulatory net, which is they're not in the financial product, financial services sort of space. That kind of line between what's in that net has always been a bit of a open question, a lot of questions asked over the time, and the government's reforms always presupposed that it would be on ASIC to make clear what's within the financial services space already and which is already subject to their regulation. So that's a necessary part of the reforms going forward, and we're always expecting that ASIC would have to provide further guidance. In some ways, it's probably beneficial that they did that before we finalise the drafting of the bill.
Okay, let me ask you a dumb question then. Do you accept that if the Parliament fails to legislate a scheme, then the corporate cop or the regulator that is closest to that market's proximity is then going to be asked by market participants for legal, almost legal advice or advice on how they can run their businesses because there's no regulatory framework in this country? And therefore you end up having legislation through a grudge, almost enforcement approach, or through a regulator sort of making it up, even though it's not their role to make laws or policy.
Senator, I think, as a general rule, that there's probably merit in what you. There's probably merit in the proposition you put forward in this particular case.
Thank you.
It was the case, though, that ASIC was always going to have to go in there and be clearer about what that boundary is, because the bill, once introduced, was going to have to rely on that. The fact that they've done that
but there
now,
is no bill.
I said when the bill gets introduced, it will have to.
The magical bill we've never seen.
But the government's stated reforms are based on the fact that there is a set of things within the financial service regulatory space, and it's up for ASIC to make clear what those things are. So ASIC was always going to have to do this. From my point of view, it's actually advantageous in drafting the bill to make sure we get to the outcomes we want, that we're able to see that before the actual bill is completed.
This is killing investment. So What about on debanking? How many Treasury staff are working on debanking?
Lynn Kelly, First Assistant Secretary, Financial System Division. So we have a branch that covers a range of issues, including debanking. I'd have to take on notice how many specifically are dedicated to debanking, because our staff tend to cover a whole range of issues on banking.
Have you met with any banks or any affected stakeholders in relation to debanking concerns?
We meet with banks and stakeholders routinely. They do talk about a range of concerns in relation to the banking. None have specifically raised with me personally around debanking, but I would have to check that whether any had raised it with my team.
In 2022, there was the Council of Financial Regulators report into debanking. Has any progress been made on that?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last
There
bit
was
of the
the
question.
Council of Financial Regulators report into debanking. Any progress there?
Yes. So
My recollection, Senator, and as Ms Kelly finds the right page in her notes, is that the majority of the recommendations made by the Council of Financial Regulators have been implemented. And these included things like more explicit guidance by the banks for customers who might be debanked, the collection of data and sharing that with the government and the like.
Yep. So there were a number of recommendations in that report. The government agreed to recommendations around the voluntary data collection on debanking to be undertaken with the 4 major banks. It also supported the recommendation that all the banks implement 5 transparency and fairness measures in relation to debanking. The government advised the major 4 banks of its expectations that they publish guidance on their risk tolerance and requirements to the digital currency exchange, fintech and remittance sectors. It also gave consideration to the fund capability uplift in the digital currency exchange, fintech and remittance sectors in the report. The government noted this recommendation and supported the objectives of the recommendation and recognised the potential that capability uplift may have.
So what has actually happened substantively on debanking in this parliament?
So we've been working with the banks in relation to the CFR's recommendations to ensure their implementation.
Why are they saying to you that they're debanking people? Why are they so keen to debank crypto or digital asset businesses, do you think?
So
Our evidence, Senator, isn't that we've had those conversations with the banks.
You haven't?
Well, I think Ms Kelly's evidence was this hasn't arisen in our conversations with the banks.
no, but I'd highlight
Because I think the industry expectation is there's got to be something done on debanking in Australia.
So the CFR report highlighted the main reasons for debanking in Australia were AML, CTF, and anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing risks, sanctions compliance, corruption, modern slavery, reputational risks, fraud and scams. So they are the main reasons for debanking currently in Australia.
Okay, and has the government adopted a policy to address the mass debanking of these businesses?
So, for instance, there were amendments made through Parliament last year in relation to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing to extend those high-risk services provided by Tranche 2 entities. So that was led by AGD, that law, but that addresses some of the reasons for debanking in Australia.
Okay, so are you working with banks on implementing the CFR review, or did I mishear you?
So we've been working with banks in relation to the government's expectations around their implementation of the 5 transparency and fairness measures, and the government was clear to the 4 major banks on its expectations around their published guidance on their risk tolerances.
And what is the expectation is they're supposed to tell businesses why they don't want to bank them, or what does it mean?
They're meant to set out their risk tolerance and their requirements so that entities understand how to fit within them.
Okay. And do you have any data or any information about how it's going?
Not since the CFR's review was released in October 2022.